The second topic or area of immigration law that I'd like to discuss is the Immigration Investor Program. Once again, you have a provincial and a federal component. What I like doing is either working on the federal side, and if I do work with a province, I work with the Quebec program. The reason for working with the Quebec program is, as in the case of the provincial nominee program, is it speeds up the process a great deal. Before getting into the speed element, let me talk generally to you about the components, the tests, what you have to require in order to be able to come into Canada under the Investors Program. And the terms for the Quebec program are the same and the federal program. There are some differences which I'll touch on later on in my presentation. Generally speaking, for the investor program, other than the medical check, the criminal check, and the security check, which you have to pass in the same way that you would for the provincial nominee program, is you have to meet three other criteria. The first criteria is that you'd have to have yourself and your spouse worldwide assets of $800,000. That's minus liability. So for example, if you have a house which is worth $1 million and you have a mortgage for $300,000, well, that would give you worldwide assets of $700,000, and you'd have to find another $100,000. Even though the test is $800,000, we'd like to have a little bit of a cushion there, maybe 20 or 30%, because you never know with the fluctuations on the Canadian dollar and whatever currency your country utilizes. So that's the first test. Simply put, husband and wife, worldwide assets, defined as assets minus liabilities of $800,000. The next test is that you have to have available $400,000 to provide to the Canadian government or to the Quebec government for 5 years. You get that money back at the end of the 5 years, but you wouldn't obtain any interest on that. Now, an option would be that rather than providing the Canadian or Quebec governments with the $400,000 over 5 years, you can actually contract with a financial institution. Ourselves and Canadian Medical Immigration and Relocation Services, we work with three banks in particular. We work with RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, which is the biggest bank in Canada. We also work with HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, as well as Desjardins, which Desjardins, strictly speaking, isn't a bank, but it's the biggest financial institution in the province of Quebec. Now, what they would do is that they would step in your shoes. So once you're accepted, well, they would provide the $400,000, and then they would get that back after 5 years without any interest. Well, you're saying that's too good to be true. Well, it is. One thing that you'd have to do is you'd have to provide the bank with $120,000 up front. You would lose that money. But for some people, the opportunity cost of doing it is great, because what you're doing in effect is you're paying the interest component up front. So if you think that over 5 years you'd be able to make a whole lot more money on the $280,000, well, then a suggestion is we would take that route. But that route doesn't change the criteria that you have to meet. So just to recap, the first criteria is $800,000 worldwide assets, minus liabilities for you and your spouse. The second one is you'd have to have available $400,000 to provide to the federal government or the Quebec government under the Quebec program. Whether you pay it or whether you contract with a financial institution to do that, bottom line is you have to have that money available at the beginning. The third criteria is that you have to have some type of qualifying business and or have in the past 5 years, out of those past 5 years, 2 years with at least 5 employees. Now, that we can play around with because the Quebec program and the federal program have a bit of variations dealing with the regulations that applies to both. But the bottom line is, for the third criteria, you have to have some type of business, either having some employees working for you or having management skills. So in effect, those are the 3 criteria. What are the advantages of this program? Well, you can get into the country pretty quickly. And also, you're having the opportunity to bring in, once again, same way as the provincial nominee program, your family.